In 1984, Jeep was not trying to impress anyone. It was trying to solve a problem. The Cherokee XJ was not designed to feel premium. It was designed to be useful, light, compact, honest about what it was. 40 years later, the Jeep badge still exists. The name still exists. But the idea behind it does not feel the same. Because in 1984, this Jeep was an idea. In 2024, this Jeep is a product. One was built around decisions made by engineers. The other is built around expectations shaped by a market. Both wear the same name. Both claim the same legacy. But they are answering very different questions. This is not a story about off-road ability. It is not a story about nostalgia. And it is not a story about which one is better. This is a story about how one simple vehicle quietly changed what an SUV could be, and how, over time, that idea slowly turned into something else. Not wrong, not bad, just different. And that difference is where this story really begins. Before the Cherokee XJ existed, the idea of an SUV was simple and limited. If you wanted something rugged, you bought a truck and lived with its compromises. If you wanted comfort, you bought a car and accepted its limits. There was very little in between. Most utility vehicles were large body-on-frame machines, heavy, crude, built to survive abuse, not daily life. They were tools first, transportation second. Jeep itself was part of that world. Its reputation was built on toughness, not refinement. Capability mattered more than convenience. But by the early 1980s, something had started to change. People wanted one vehicle that could do more than one job, something easier to live with, something that did not feel like a punishment on paved roads. This was not about chasing luxury, it was about practicality. American roads were changing. Suburbs were expanding. Families were driving more, not less. And the gap between cars and trucks was becoming obvious. That gap is where the Cherokee XJ entered the picture. Not as a statement, not as a lifestyle object, but as a rethink. Jeep did not try to make a smaller truck, and it did not try to make a tall car. Instead, it questioned the structure itself. What if an SUV did not need a heavy frame? What if size could be reduced without losing usefulness? What if everyday driving mattered as much as durability? These were quiet questions, but the answers would reshape an entire market. At the time, very few people noticed what Jeep had actually done. They saw a compact, boxy vehicle. They saw practicality. They did not yet see the shift it was about to start. That realization would come later. The Cherokee XJ did not begin as a styling exercise. It began as a structural decision. Jeep chose to abandon the traditional body-on-frame layout. Instead, it used a unibody construction, something closer to a car than a truck. At the time, this was not a safe choice. It was a risky one. A unibody meant less weight. Less weight meant better road behavior. And better road behavior meant people could actually live with it every day. The XJ was shorter than most utility vehicles of its time, narrower, lower. It fit in parking spaces without drama. It fit on city streets without feeling out of place. Nothing about it was oversized, and that was intentional. Jeep engineers were not trying to make a statement. They were trying to remove friction. The suspension was tuned for mixed use, not just trails, not just highways, but the space in between where most driving actually happens. Inside, the design was honest. Flat surfaces, clear sight lines, controls that made sense without explanation. This was not minimalism for style. It was simplicity for clarity. The XJ did not try to isolate the driver from the road. It did not try to overwhelm with features. It asked the driver to participate. You felt the surface you were on. You understood what the vehicle was doing. There was no illusion of effortlessness, and that honesty built trust. The Cherokee XJ was not marketed as luxury. It was not sold as an adventure fantasy. It was presented as useful, a vehicle you could drive to work, load with gear, take down a rough road on the weekend, and drive home without feeling punished for the choice. That balance was rare. Most vehicles at the time forced a compromise: comfort or capability, space or efficiency. The XJ quietly refused that trade-off. It was not the fastest. It was not the most comfortable. It was not the most capable in extreme conditions, but it was good enough at everything that mattered. That is what made it dangerous to the market, because once people experienced an SUV that behaved like a car without losing its utility, expectations changed. Drivers realized they did not need a truck to live an active life. They did not need a sedan to enjoy daily comfort. The XJ blurred that line, and it did so without asking for praise. There were no dramatic design cues, no oversized grills, no attempt to signal status. Its shape was a consequence of function. Flat panels for space, straight lines for visibility, nothing more than what was needed. That is why it aged the way it did, not as a fashion object, but as a reference point. People did not always remember the XJ by name, but they remembered how it felt to use. It created a category before the category had a name, and once that idea existed, it could not be taken back. Every crossover, every compact SUV, every attempt to blend comfort with utility traces back to this moment. Not because the XJ was perfect, but because it was clear about what it was trying to be. That clarity is what made it last. And it is also what makes the comparison with modern SUVs so uncomfortable. Because when you look closely at the Cherokee XJ, you are not just seeing an old Jeep. You are seeing an idea that was never meant to become a product line. And that idea is about to be tested by what came after. The Cherokee XJ was never meant to start a movement. It was meant to fill a gap. But once that gap was filled, the market noticed. Other manufacturers saw something important. People were choosing the XJ not because it was extreme, but because it made sense. It was easier to drive than a truck, more flexible than a sedan, and it did not ask the owner to commit to a single lifestyle. That balance changed expectations. Competitors did not copy the XJ directly. They copied the result. Suddenly, utility vehicles no longer had to feel rough. They no longer had to announce themselves as tools. They could be everyday transportation without apology. This is where the shift quietly began. As demand grew, the ideas started to stretch. Vehicles became slightly larger, slightly more comfortable, slightly more refined. Each step made sense on its own. More sound insulation, more safety equipment, more features that made daily driving easier. But with every addition, weight increased, complexity increased, and the original clarity began to soften. The SUV was no longer just solving a problem, it was responding to preferences. What began as a practical alternative slowly became a default choice. Families bought them because they felt safe. Drivers bought them because they felt versatile. Manufacturers built them because they sold. And once something becomes the default, it changes. Design decisions are no longer guided by necessity alone. They are guided by expectation. Ride height becomes an image. Size becomes reassurance. Features become requirements. The market did not ask for less. It asked for more. And Jeep was no longer alone in answering that call. By the time SUVs dominated driveways and parking lots, the original XJ philosophy had already done its job. It had proven that people wanted one vehicle to do many things. It had removed the old boundary between cars and trucks, but it could not control what happened next. Because ideas do not age the way products do. They evolve. They get interpreted. They get reshaped. The Cherokee XJ did not lose relevance. It lost ownership of the conversation. And that is how an idea becomes an industry, not through intention, but through adoption. What followed was not betrayal, it was momentum. And momentum would eventually lead Jeep to a very different kind of Cherokee. By the time the 2024 Grand Cherokee arrives, the conversation has already changed. This Jeep is not trying to redefine anything. It is trying to meet expectations that already exist. The modern Grand Cherokee is larger, heavier, and far more complex than the XJ ever was. And that is not a mistake. It is a response. Today's buyer expects quiet cabins. They expect smooth rides. They expect screens, assistance systems, and a feeling of insulation from the outside world. The 2024 Grand Cherokee delivers all of that. On the road, it feels composed. It absorbs rough pavement without effort. Wind and tire noise are carefully managed. The experience is calm, controlled, and predictable. This is not an accident of engineering. It is the goal. Inside, the focus is comfort and reassurance. Materials feel deliberate. Technology is always present. The driver is not asked to think much about what the vehicle is doing. The Grand Cherokee does the thinking for you. And for many people, that is exactly the point. This Jeep is designed to fit into modern life without friction. Commutes, school runs, long highway trips. It is not trying to challenge the driver. It is trying to remove effort. That makes it a very good product. but it also means it is solving a different problem than the XJ once did. The XJ asked how much vehicle was truly necessary. The modern Grand Cherokee asks how much comfort can be provided without compromise. One reduced complexity to gain versatility. The other adds complexity to gain refinement. Neither approach is wrong. They simply reflect different priorities. Where the XJ was built around restraint, the 2024 Grand Cherokee is built around accommodation. It carries more weight because it carries more responsibility, safety systems, luxury expectations, regulations, market pressure. All of that shapes what this vehicle is allowed to be. So when people say the modern Jeep is no longer simple, they are not pointing out a failure. They are describing a consequence. The Grand Cherokee is not trying to be remembered as an idea. It is trying to succeed as a product. And in that role, it succeeds. But this is where the comparison becomes uncomfortable, because once both vehicles are placed side by side, the difference is no longer about age or technology. It is about philosophy. And that philosophy is about to be tested directly. When the 1984 Cherokee XJ and the 2024 Grand Cherokee are placed side by side, the difference is immediate. Not in quality, not in capability, but in intent. The XJ feels light because it is light. Every decision around it was made to reduce excess. Less structure, less weight, less separation between the driver and the machine. You sit upright. You see the edges of the hood. You feel the road through the steering and the chassis. Nothing is hidden. The modern Grand Cherokee does the opposite. It isolates. The cabin is quiet by design. Inputs are softened. Systems step in before the driver ever notices a problem. This is not about skill. It is about comfort. The XJ assumes the driver is part of the process. The Grand Cherokee assumes the driver wants the process handled. Ownership tells the same story. With the XJ, simplicity meant longevity, fewer systems to manage, fewer layers between cause and effect. Things wore out, but they were understood. Problems were visible. Fixes were direct. The modern Grand Cherokee trades that clarity for assurance. Sensors replace judgment. Software replaces feel. Maintenance becomes less about wear and more about coordination between systems. Again, this is not failure. It is evolution. But evolution always has a cost. The XJ feels adaptable because it asks less of its environment. Tight spaces do not intimidate it. Rough roads do not overwhelm it. The Grand Cherokee feels capable because it brings more with it. More mass, more technology, more protection. One survives through restraint, the other through compensation. Even success is measured differently. The XJ succeeded because it disappeared into daily life. It became normal without trying to be. The Grand Cherokee succeeds because it stands up to comparison, against rivals, against expectations, against price points. One did not need to justify itself. The other must constantly do so. This is where the comparison becomes clear. The Cherokee XJ was a vehicle shaped by limits. The Grand Cherokee is a vehicle shaped by demands. Neither is wrong, but they could not exist for the same reason. And if they had been launched in the same era, they would not have competed on features or performance. They would have competed on philosophy. And that is a competition no spec sheet can settle. The real shift did not happen inside Jeep. It happened around it. As SUVs became more common, their purpose slowly changed. They stopped being alternatives. They became expectations. Buyers no longer asked what they truly needed. They asked what they might want someday. More space felt safer. More features felt smarter. More weight felt reassuring. And manufacturers listened. This is where simplicity became difficult to defend, not because it stopped working, but because it stopped selling itself. Restraint is hard to market. Clarity does not photograph well, and practicality rarely sounds exciting. The Cherokee XJ belonged to a moment when usefulness was enough, when a vehicle did not need to explain itself. But modern vehicles live in a louder environment. Comparisons are constant. Expectations are layered. Silence is interpreted as absence. So vehicles filled that silence with features, with screens, with systems designed to anticipate every scenario. Not because drivers demanded them individually, but because the market demanded reassurance. Jeep did not abandon its past. It adapted to its present. The Grand Cherokee exists because the world around it changed. Roads changed. Regulations changed. Buyers changed. And once those changes take hold, they do not reverse easily. The mistake is thinking this was a loss of identity. It was not. It was a shift in responsibility. The XJ asked drivers to engage. The modern Grand Cherokee asks drivers to trust. Both approaches solve problems. They just solve different ones. And that difference matters. Because when people talk about what SUVs used to be, they are often talking about how they used to feel. Light, direct, understandable. What they are really missing is not a specific vehicle, it is a relationship. A time when driving felt less managed and more shared between human and machine. That feeling did not disappear by accident. It faded because the world decided comfort was more important than clarity. And that decision reshaped everything that followed. When people talk about the Cherokee XJ today, they are not really talking about an old Jeep. They are talking about an idea that felt complete, an idea that knew its limits and stayed inside them. The XJ did not try to be everything. It did not try to predict every future need. It focused on the present, and it did that well. The modern Grand Cherokee represents a different reality, a world where vehicles are expected to cover every scenario, to protect, assist, anticipate, and reassure. It carries that responsibility seriously, and because of that, it cannot be simple in the way the XJ was. If the Cherokee XJ were launched today, it would not fail because it was bad. It would struggle because clarity is harder to explain than comfort. Because restraint is quieter than excess, and quiet things are easy to overlook. This does not make the past better, and it does not make the present worse. It simply shows how priorities change. The XJ belongs to a time when a vehicle earned trust by being understandable. The modern Grand Cherokee belongs to a time when trust is earned by removing uncertainty. Both reflect the world that created them, and that is the real comparison. Not old versus new, not simple versus complex, but idea versus product. And once you see that difference, you cannot unsee it. Because every SUV on the road today is still answering a question first asked quietly by a small, boxy Jeep in 1984. And that question never really went away.